Well, welcome to week 10 of our current series, What Did Jesus Do? Now this week, I want us to look at something that Jesus did, which was theoretically, culturally, and spiritually unacceptable. Yeah, you heard me right. Culturally and spiritually acceptable at the time anyway, back in the day. Because of course we know, don't we, Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. Therefore we know that what he did was not wrong. But what did Jesus do? So this week, we're going to look at three people. And while these are not three people that you and I might be like, as we actually looked at last week, do you remember those scenarios with those people in the boat, 4 different scenarios? The people we'll look at this week might be representative of scenarios that we find ourselves in as we continue through this pandemic. But also as we start to emerge. And there are suspicions maybe around how we engage with each other, both now and also in the future. Now I'm actually calling this week's message, Touching the Untouchables. Now the first person we'll look at is a leper. You can follow that in Mark 1 if you want, 43 to 45. And the second is a demon-possessed man. Again, you can look that up in Luke 4 if you want to put your finger in there. And the third person is going to be the Samaritan Woman. Hopefully you know well they're in John 4 as well. So the first person, the leper, let's dive in. Mark 1, 40 through to 45. And I'm actually reading from the NIV on purpose. Maybe a little clue if you know this passage well. But this is what it says. This is from Mark. And I'm starting here in verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him, that's Jesus, and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Verse 43, Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go. Show yourself to the priests and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet, the people still came to him from everywhere. Now, you've probably heard many messages on this, so I'm not actually going to major on all the points in this particular passage. But I'm going to pick out some key thoughts or maybe some questions from it for us to consider. So firstly, why is leprosy so bad? Now, one commentator, let me read this to you, put it like this. You'll probably say it's an obvious answer, Darren. Why is leprosy so bad? But let me just read this to you. It says this: leprosy, the very word, filled people with horror. The Jews regarded it as the stroke of God. The leper carried about in his body corruption, contamination, and death. Society ostracized and rigidly segregated him lest he contaminate others in the community. If anyone wandered into his vicinity, he had to cover his mouth and cry, "Unclean, unclean," to warn the other person away. He was excommunicated from religious life, functions and feasts of the nation. His only companions were other lepers in the same pitiable condition as himself. He could not work because who would want goods and services of a leper? He could not come and go as he pleased. He endured a living death because his disease spread and was incurable. You see, the man knew he was unclean and he wanted to be clean. And we see that right at the start of verse 40, don't we? He was on his knees. And actually, if you read the same account there in Matthew, it says Jesus just come down from the mountainside. A large crowd or large crowds were with him. They followed him. So this leper is probably breaking the social or religious guidelines just by being there and pushing past others to get to Jesus. And yet, here is this leper, an outcast, totally understanding that Jesus, he's not denying Jesus' power, that Jesus can make him clean. But he didn't want to know that. He wanted to know if Jesus was willing. What did Jesus do? Now, I read from the NIV on purpose here because it uses a word which other translations record as something different. Now, if you look in your Bibles at verse 41, what does it say? It says either indignant, NIV, or moved with compassion, or something about compassion. Now, I don't want to get stuck on this because it's what did Jesus do? This is the whole point. But actually, you might say, well, hang on a minute, Darren, aren't these two words a polar opposite? But we've got to look at the context, haven't we? We've got Jesus, Son of God, whose mission it is to bring healing and salvation. With power and authority, Jesus' desire is both of these things. Of course, Jesus is moved with compassion to heal the man. It's recorded that Jesus reached out his hand, didn't he, and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And we read immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. But actually, the NIV translates it as indignant. And indignant, of course, Jesus is indignant. But the people, and why was he indignant? Because the people probably just don't get it yet. You know, Jesus is on his way to the cross. And even the disciples here don't understand what's going on. Jesus had both the desire and the ability. The leper, as I said a moment ago, had no doubt about Jesus' ability, but he wanted to know what was Jesus' desire. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Jesus wasn't actually made unclean in this process when he touched the leper. And actually, if you look into the way the Greek language is constructed, you can see that Jesus spoke and touched at the same time. What we could see from this is Jesus was actually the first one to touch the leper as a clean man. Now, I'm going to leave that there just for a moment, and we're going to pick up some more of this in a minute. I want to introduce us to the second person this morning that we're going to look at. And this is the demon-possessed man that you can read about in Luke 4, 31 through to 36. That's Luke 4, 31 through to 36. And this is what it says. Jesus drives out an impure spirit. Verse 31, then he, that's Jesus, went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. Verse 33, in the synagogue there was a man possessed by a demon, note in the synagogue, an impure spirit. He cried out at the top of his voice, go away, what do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Verse 35, be quiet, Jesus said sternly, come out of him. Then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out without injuring him. All the people were amazed and said to each other, what words these are! With authority and power he gives orders to impure spirits and they come out. And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. Now, for the sake of time, we'll focus on this shorter passage, but if you actually start looking through the scriptures, there's many examples of Jesus confronting demons, isn't there? I mean, you'll probably think of some off the top of your head, the legion and the pigs, maybe the healing of the mute person, when Jesus was heckled when he was curing the sick there, Luke 4:41, when the disciples are unable to drive out demons. There's the Greek woman's daughter, Matthew 15 and Mark 7. And of course, Mary Magdalene as well. I don't know if you remember in both the Gospels there, in both Mark and Luke, it describes Mary Magdalene as someone out of whom Jesus had driven out 7 demons. And as future stuff, of course, Jesus sends out disciples, doesn't he, with authority and power over demons. We can see, or what we see here, is that most of these examples show someone who society no longer wants to deal with. Like the leper, they're cast out from society, even to live among the tombs like the dead. What did Jesus do? Well, Jesus touches the untouchables that society wanted nothing to do with, nor could they control either. And Jesus deals with the demons and instructs the disciples to go and do likewise. Now again, let's just pause for a moment, leave that there and move on to our third person, the Samaritan woman. John 4, you probably know it well, John 4, the first few verses there, 1 through to 26. Now, like I say, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. Hopefully you are familiar with the story. You're welcome to read that later yourself, jot it down. But hopefully we've heard this passage a few times and we remember, don't we? Jesus is traveling through Samaria. He stops at Jacob's well and asks a Samaritan woman for a drink. Now, there's nothing odd about that. And actually, if you read that for the first time with your 21st century glasses on, you're going to say, what's going on here? But what did Jesus do? How did Jesus touch the untouchable here? Well, historically, there's so much going on, isn't there? Firstly, even being a Samaritan was lower than the lowest from the perspective of the Jew. Now, in a sort of broad brush statement, these guys had really fallen out with each other. You can look into the details. And the Jews really wanted nothing to do with Samaritans. Read yourself. But suffice to say, the picture that we have of the Samaritans in our modern day society of being those helpful, kind people on the end of a telephone in a moment of need is really the polar opposite to what a Jew thought about a Samaritan. And let's add some geography to this too. Jesus was heading north from Judea to Galilee. And it was so, the hatred between these guys was so big that actually often the Jewish people wouldn't take that direct route through Samaria. They'd actually turn right, cross over the River Jordan or the Jordan River, walk up past Samaria and then come back into Galilee, which puts a considerable distance on the journey. Don't quite double it, but it's quite a considerable time. Now, Jesus is here going through Samaria. It's kind of a big deal. This would make any Jewish rabbi very uncomfortable. And Jesus is here, we recorded in Sychar, almost in the middle of Samaria. Now, there's a second thing here that's going on. There's a woman in this passage. Now, Jesus is stepping over some long-standing cultural barriers here. Rabbis were forbidden to speak to women in public, even their wife. And there is one rabbinical law which states it's better to burn the law than give it to a woman. These are harsh things, aren't they? Now, just do some simple maths here. Add those two things up. Jesus is not only speaking to this woman, he's asked her for a drink of water. Jesus touches the untouchable because theoretically, by touching even the water pot that she had, he would become ceremonially defiled. Now, this passage is not shocking to us today, but it would have been massively shocking back in the day. Jesus is not only talking to a woman, but a Samaritan woman. But Jesus crosses over that, doesn't he? He demonstrates something here that Paul later writes to the Galatians about. There in Galatians, what we got here, 3:28. And it says those words, you probably know it well as I start it. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Galatians 3:28. Now let's bring these examples together because I just gave you a very brief overview of three different people. But I believe they're really relevant to us today. Jesus is always doing something about bringing healing. And that's not just physical healing, but obviously salvation, that eternal healing. That leper, once healed, was not concerned about heading off to the temple to get his I'm clean badge on there and doing all the ceremonial things, but instead he instantly became evangelist, didn't he? Albeit he missed the obedient part that Jesus says, look, can be quiet about this and sort yourself out. He started a bit too soon. Probably a good lesson for us too here. We need to listen to what Jesus says and be obedient in the right time. The other person here, the demon-possessed man or demon-possessed people, you can look at those. They were instrumental in their testimony of who Jesus was. They too were evangelists pointing people to Jesus. And the Samaritan woman was not only saved, but her testimony and the hearing of those in her town, John 4:41, became believers too. What Jesus never did was unlawful or wrong, as I said at the start. And actually, as a result, it brought healing and salvation to all. So what's the challenge for us today? How do we do what Jesus did? Well, here's three closing thoughts. Just ponder on this for a moment. Number one, are we prepared to touch the untouchables? Are we prepared to touch the untouchables? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for us anyway? What does that mean for us in a COVID society or a post-COVID society? Are we ever going to get rid of COVID? How do we deal with that in the future? Are we serious about healing? Do we believe healing is even possible today? Second thing, I can't see anywhere in my Bible, you can let me know if it's in yours, where it says that demons have suddenly disappeared and they're no longer here. Not to get too bogged down with demonic stuff today, but how should we respond to the reality of evil in our own spiritual lives, but also in the lives of those around us who are trapped or controlled by evil things? We live in times, don't we, which don't actually believe in silly old-fashioned Bible myths anymore about ghosts and ghoulies and demons and all of that stuff. But if you believe in Jesus, if you've read his word, you will see that Jesus was serious about sorting them out. Here's a question for us today. What are we doing about demons? Number 3, are we prepared to go to the places that others avoid? Are we prepared to go to the places that others avoid, like Jesus did? Or will we be like those Jews which skirt around the outside? We'll walk an extra street or an extra mile just to go down a different path because we know where we're going. If we're going to go a certain way, it will demand us to deal with things we might not want to deal with. Now, in each of these scenarios, please hear me clearly. I'm not telling you to do something which is unsafe, and I'm certainly not talking about being unlawful. But what I am talking about, and I've mentioned it through many other messages before, and I'm starting to hear people in the congregation say it now, I'm talking about having that others first mindset, where we're others centered. That's a phrase that's come back to me. To have an ear to hear God's call and obedience to do what Jesus did when God calls us to do it. When God speaks to us, are we prepared to listen, and are we going to be doers? Jesus was always about mission, wasn't he? Always about mission and serving others. And maybe you can just use that word again. His indignation challenges us that the very thought not to want to heal someone, to see someone saved, actually goes against the very core of what the gospel compels us to do. Is indignation the actual right word? We should be so fired up about this. Someone was sharing earlier this week, they were fired up about something else and how much compassion they had towards that. And yet, when it comes to the lost, do we have that same heart? Do we know this compassion that Jesus has? Do our hearts truly break for what breaks his? There's some lyrics in the bridge of our final song which we're going to listen to in a moment, and it says these words which I think actually would make a great prayer. If you're looking for a really short prayer to pray every morning, why don't you pray this? Heal my heart and make it clean. Open up my eyes to the things unseen. Jesus, will you show me how to love like you have loved me? And it goes on, break my heart for what breaks yours. Everything I am for your kingdom's cause as I walk from earth into eternity. We need to pray for wisdom, don't we? We need to pray for wisdom of how we can be those people that are able to touch the untouchables just like Jesus did. There's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? God bless you.